Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In less than 18 hours, Nigerians are set to vote in presidential elections that are seen as the most wide open in a quarter of a century. The Independent National Electoral Commission has assured world leaders that the ballot will be free and fair, and the entire world will be watching events happening across the country this weekend, as the result and the mammoth democratic process unfolding will have ripple effects across the region and beyond. On today's Channel's Business Global, I'll be examining the socio-economic, geopolitical and diaspora perspective of the world's most important election this year. Here in our London studio, I'll be joined by author, lawyer and historian Dele Ogun, and virtually I'll be joined by Patrick Akinwuntan, the former Managing Director and Regional Executive of EcoBank Nigeria, and PwC Nigeria's Chief Economist Andrew Nevin. But first, let's have a look at some of the international headlines that have been trending online over the past few days. This one from CNBC says unpredictable election in Africa's largest economy is set to resonate around the world. Elliot Smith then details some of the major focal points, one being that tomorrow's ballot will have a significant bearing not only on Nigeria's domestic economy and security, but on its place in the global trade and diplomatic framework, and on faith in democratic transitions in West Africa. Ian Bremmer of Time magazine has written this risk report headlined "What's at Stake in Nigeria's Presidential Election?" He goes on to focus on the country's acute fuel shortages, the 13-year insurgency of the terrorist group Boko Haram, and that 40% of the population are living below the poverty line. Then this from Al Jazeera, under a picture of President Muhammadu Buhari with the International Monetary Fund chief Christine Lagarde. The subheading reads, "Ahead of the election, Africa's largest economy is in a precarious position due to rising debt and low revenue." We will be looking at more newspaper headlines later on in the show. Well, of course, there is plenty to unpack, so let's now speak with our first guest. Patrick Akinwuntan is a chartered accountant, Pan-African banker and fintech expert. He holds an MBA, is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria and an alumnus of the Harvard Business School. He has a distinguished professional career spanning 35 years, 26 of which was at the EcoBank Group, where he held various executive positions and was managing director, CEO and regional executive until March 2022. He's joining me from Lagos State. Patrick Akinwuntan, thank you so much for taking time out to speak with me on Channel's Business Global today. I was just running through a slew of international headlines for our viewers. I think it's safe to say that the entire world's gaze is currently on Nigeria. There is a lot at stake. Inflation is almost at 22%. The Naira currency has weakened, and the World Bank says more Nigerians are now living below the poverty line than at any other time in history. Rather than focusing on how we got here, because I know there's always a blame game going on, how do we get out of this, Patrick?
Well, thank you very much, Juliana. The fact is there's so much that we can do to improve our lot in Nigeria. I mean, we're a great nation. We're blessed with highly intellectual people. Our people is our greatest resource. We have good land resources, and we have an entrepreneurial spirit, a never say never spirit. So what we need to look at is what are those fundamentals which we need to tackle with courage. So I'll go quickly. I'll list three. The third is in three parts. The first is security. We need to have a secure environment for our farmers to be able to go to farm, to be productive. Agriculture provides the largest employment base. It also reduces food inflation. It promotes, reduces import bill. So security is absolutely key. The second that is key is education. Beyond academic education, we need to invest in skills. Our people are very keen. They can compete. We're very competitive. And so with the right investment in our local educational system, let's look at it. We spent on an average through formal channels, we remit about $2 billion payment for education outside Nigeria. If we were to add other private arrangements, that could easily eclipse $4 billion. That is money we can invest rightly in education, and ensure that our lecturers are fairly paid. The third is what I call fixing the tripod of subsidies. That is essentially choking life out of our economy and the unseen hand that is feeding corruption. What are those three items? FX, the FX rate need to be one FX rate. Whether we say there is official rate and the other market, the fact is the market does not lie. No one will focus on exports, or the diaspora will not bring in their resources to support the local economy in the level they should if the rates are not transparent and acceptable to all. If you look at diaspora economy, which you allow me to speak on quickly, if we assume $25 billion as inward remittance annually, and we estimate that 5% is just what the average Nigerian in diaspora will remit back home, that's a wallet size of about $500 billion annually in earnings by Nigerians in diaspora. Our GDP is just about $500 billion, so that is huge. The other two is fuel subsidy. 7 trillion naira is our run rate of fuel subsidy. That's about $15 billion at the official rate. That is huge. We could invest that in rail, in education, in health, and ensure that we have a productive economy. The last is subsidy on power. As a former lender, I've seen discos basically dying under the yoke of fixed prices, or call it subsidized prices. Power should be allowed to operate like telecoms has done. Our country should be able to operate 24/7. Let price and value determine who survives. We know how to survive in Nigeria. So these are fundamentals. We get this right, focused leadership, a good enforcement of rule of law, and Nigeria is set to take its rightful place.
Patrick, thank you so much for that succinct breakdown there. I would love to feast upon what you've just mentioned, but we don't have the time. We will have to invite you back on because they are really valid points. I want to go into this Naira redesign. I don't want to call it chaos, but it appears to be chaos. There is a chronic shortage of cash at the moment. It's created huge queues outside of banks. It's triggered protests. We've seen some devastating scenes in some cities. When are we likely to see this tension and frustration ease over this policy?
Thank you. Again, this is the difference between policy and execution. Policy, you look at the policy, not much to fault. I think it's a positive policy. That's the cashless policy. For a country as big as Nigeria, it should do well, but we need to look at the execution. First, we need to keep the ability of Nigerians to onboard into cashless very simple. It is known that if there is fundamental transformation that aligns with the way people exist, it is easier. So for instance, it is cheaper to collect money at ATM than to do transfers for payments. If you do transfer for payments, you will pay certain service charges. You will even pay certain taxes. That's why everybody is flocking to the ATM and causing a lot of queue. It should be simple. We should simply have wallets that uses your phone number as your account number. We already have NIN. That's significant investment, the national identification number. So with your national identification number and your phone number, you should be good to go. In terms of scalability, the platforms should be robust. We're looking for platforms that will handle 200 million people. We're about number 5, number 6 in payments volumes, electronic payments volumes in the world. It is huge. And as we've seen, as people tried to then move onto those platforms, we have seen failures. And that has exasperated the populace, and that's why there's a rush at the ATM. So scalability of the platforms, we need to call the telcos together. This is a national call. If the CBN or the government needs to pay 3 months and make it free data for everybody so that it can compete with cash. Today, if you have cash, you feel it is free. It is not really free, as we can see. But then we need a near free solution that people can use. User experience, tap and pay is my most ideal. Feature phones must work. I mean, every Nigerian has a feature phone. I love smartphones. but it does not penetrate the grassroots like feature phones. So let's put a strip that allows tap and pay on our feature phones, and the user experience will be great. And finally, we need to bring all our eggheads that know financial technology. I mean, this is Nigeria. We've got great kids all around the globe. Let's bring them together and challenge them. We want to be number one or world best in a cashless society. We can do it. So the policy it is, but the execution needs to be much better.
Patrick Akinwuntan, chartered accountant, Pan-African banker, fintech expert, and the most immediate former managing director, regional executive at EcoBank Nigeria. Thank you so much for your time and your optimism today. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Juliana. All the best.
We are, of course, remaining with this topic, looking ahead to tomorrow's all-important ballot. For a further economic dive, let's now speak with Dr. Andrew Nevin, the advisory partner and chief economist at PwC Nigeria. Andrew joins me virtually from here in the British capital. Andrew Nevin, it's always a pleasure speaking with you on Channel's Business Global. It's pretty much an understatement to say that the entire world's press are focused on Nigeria this weekend. I was reading one opinion piece in CNN, which has described this weekend's ballot as being one of the largest democratic exercises on planet Earth. What was the mood music on the ground before you left for London?
Well, I mean, it's stressful in Nigeria right now. I mean, we have the normal issues that would happen with any election. I think it's maybe the fourth election that I've been since I've come to Nigeria, but it's overlaid by the Naira crisis. So, I mean, we can speculate why this happened, but the fact you had a shortage of money, economic activity ground to a halt, people really suffered. So you had, running into the election, you had all the things that would normally happening and the complexities with INEC and getting the materials out and the observation, and then you suddenly had no cash to pay people. So it's a very difficult situation right now as we come into the next 2 days.
It's difficult right now. It's been difficult for the past few months, and we did have a credit devaluation by Moody's in January over concerns about the country's debt repayment capacity. Now, there are several issues that the next leader is going to inherit, but where can we find the money for our severely underfunded public services if 80% of revenue generated from tax is used to pay for reservicing this debt?
Well, I mean, I think our position over the years has been very clear and remains the same, which is this is not a revenue problem. It's a growth problem. I mean, the reality is the economy has not grown. I mean, it's grown at less than the population growth for the entire term of His Excellency President Buhari's presidency. And so then the idea that you're going to take more revenue out of people that are getting poorer and poorer is very difficult. So unless you're going to grow the economy 6 or 8%, we're going to continue to face these problems. Now, when we said this in 2017, we were a long way away from any debt crisis because I think we had debt to GDP of maybe 20%, between 20 and 25%. I mean, that situation's changed. It's hard to keep up with the numbers, and particularly when you're talking in trillions with the Naira, or hundreds of trillions. I mean, it's a 300 trillion Naira economy, so it's hard to actually track the numbers. But I mean, I think now the debt is between about 40 to 50% of GDP, so it's not flashing red. But unless there's some growth in the next administration, we're going to continue to have these problems, and you're not going to be able to pay for any public services. But I mean, the other part of it, though, I think, is that the government, particularly the federal government, they need to demonstrate that there's a social contract where if people actually pay their taxes, they get value for it. And I think right now you continue to have this perception they're trying to take more revenue out of the system, but people are not getting compensated. We have continued issues around the foil subsidy and corruption. We have continued money going into Azure Coated Steel and the refinery, government-owned refineries, for example. Many examples where people perceive there's wasteful expenditure. So under those circumstances, why would people want to pay more taxes? They'll pay more taxes when they see a social contract where services are delivered. I mean, Nigeria is a big deal. But, as I said, I'm optimistic because, when you look at what's happening in the country, all the problems are known. And the people are clamoring for solutions. And I think this election is going to be an amazing event. And I really pray it's peaceful. And I really pray we get a good result and we end up with an administration that's going to face up to the issues that we all understand in Nigeria.
Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist at PwC Nigeria, thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your optimism and happy birthday for Sunday. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Thank you so much.
We continue this Nigeria election special episode by taking a further look at some of the international headlines that have been trending online over the past few days. This Pete's in Court asks, where are Nigeria's women in the upcoming elections? Under an image of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the Liberian politician who was the first elected female head of state in Africa, the editorial notes that since gaining independence in 1960, Nigeria has not yet had any women presidents or vice presidents. Germany's DW claims Nigerians are angry about the country's economic woes and violent conflicts. And according to Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who is pictured here with Nigeria's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyema, Nigeria is not just any country, but a voice that carries international weight. And finally, this from the Wall Street Journal. This lengthy essay, authored by Nick Cheeseman, suggests that the prospects of manipulation and violence occurring this weekend is increasingly likely. Hopefully not. Shortly, I'll be sharing an interview I conducted with author, lawyer and historian Dele Ogun. But before then, here's a look back at some of the key campaign moments that occurred right here in the British capital.
The expectations place a great responsibility on the election management body, the Independent National Electoral Commission. We are not taking these responsibilities lightly. We appreciate that there are challenges and concerns, but we also realize that there is enormous goodwill and support, both in Nigeria and beyond. Consequently, we believe that by forthrightly sharing our experiences and discussing the challenges openly, we can surmount the challenges and ensure that our elections in Nigeria continue to get better. May I, on this note, once again reiterate our position that the Commission is not contemplating, let alone planning, to postpone the 2023 general election. We are going ahead to conduct the election as scheduled. But by way of preliminary remarks, I wish to remind you about three important facts about Nigeria's election, which I believe many of you are aware of. Number one, given the geographical expanse of the country, the number of registered voters, electoral constituencies, and polling units, conducting general election in Nigeria is a huge undertaking. The delimitation details are simply staggering. 93.4 million registered voters expected to elect their representatives in 1,491 constituencies.
Let's now hear the thoughts from a Nigerian living in the diaspora, Dele Ogun, a lawyer, the author of A Fatherless People and the convener of the Fatherland Group. Dele Ogun, it's a pleasure to have you in the Channel's Business Global studio. It's less than 18 hours that the polls are going to be open. I've said this continuously throughout the show, but the world's gaze is squarely on Nigeria at the moment. On Monday, Nick Cheeseman, who happens to actually be, I believe, a UK lecturer, he wrote an essay in the Wall Street Journal that said some observers already consider Nigeria a failed state. What are these actors observing?
What are the signs? We remember the Kaduna Abuja train kidnapping incident. I speak from experience. I was one who contributed towards the 100 million that was paid to rescue my best man from that train after months of kidnapping.
Goodness, I didn't know that.
That's part of the reality. The other reality is that every time I go to Nigeria historically, I would always go to my village. But the security situation, by virtue of those kidnapping episodes, the frequency, the regularity, and the impunity with which it was being conducted, meant that I haven't been able to go. That's part of the reality. The up-to-date reality is people, Nigerians, being reduced to trade by barter by virtue of this currency crisis that the has generated with this mad currency change. That is part of the reality. The other significant, and perhaps the most significant, is this. We know that troops have been out on the streets against Boko Haram, ISIS in the north, almost, well, for as long as we can remember.
13-year insurgency.
That's the reality out there, troops out. We also know that troops have been deployed repeatedly in the Middle Belt areas, the southern Kaduna crisis, where troops are having to be called in. We know that troops have been in occupation of certainly Igbo land for as long as this administration has been in power, since 2015. And most recently, just last week, we saw troops being deployed to Lagos. Now remember...
That's for safety.
Whatever the reason.
That's
the
for
mere
security
fact that you
purposes.
have to deploy troops, police are supposed to deal with that. Law and order is supposed to deal with that, not those who are trained to kill.
Nigerian society, as we know, is one of the most diverse in the world. And I think sometimes from the outside looking in, you're like, oh my goodness, it's so complex. How is this mosaic working? What are the hopes? And I want us to try to be as optimistic as we can. What are the hopes from the diaspora? You are the convener of a global network of Nigerians, the Fatherland Group. I know you do extensive work. You hold huge conferences, both online and in person. You speak to them on a daily basis. What are we hoping for as power changes hands next week?
The structure that we need is one that reflects and runs with the groove. The groove of Nigerians is their ethnic identity. It is their Hausa, it is their Igbo, it is their Kanuri, their Ijaw, their Yoruba, Fulani identity. If you work with that reality, then you can have a stable union. We've been running with denial, you see, but now the international community can see in the Ukraine crisis, you see the problem of ethnicity with the Donbass region, that it's what is source for the goose is source for the gander, because the model that the Fatherland Group has proposed, we call it the Orange Union, because when you peel the skin of the orange, you see the segments sitting comfortably side by side, unique and distinct, but forming part of the whole. So Nigeria doesn't have to be scattered and broken up. It just needs to be reconfigured along its natural lines, natural dimensions.
We're running out of time, and I do want to get your point on this before we close the show. Again, it's an obvious question, but is it fair to say that the outcome of tomorrow's ballot is going to shape the political and economic prospects, not just for Nigeria, but for the entire region, and dare I say it, the world?
It is a defining election in terms of where Nigeria goes from here.
It's always a pleasure speaking with you, Dele Ogun.
It's a pleasure.
Author, historian, lawyer, convener of the global network, a global Nigerian network, the Fatherland Group, also Fatherless People, absolutely insightful reading, life-affirming read, actually. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For your honest overview and your predictions. Thank you, Dele.
Thanks so much.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I think it's only right that I take this final opportunity to plead with you all, my dear beloved brothers and sisters. Do not just be an observer. Please use your God-given right and, of course, your PVC card to go out and vote. Do it on our behalf. Stay safe. Be courageous and remain hopeful. I promise I will see you on the other side at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.